So host, I think we are now at 8:30. Badaniam. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think we're gonna start now. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ya, alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Salatu wassalamu ala asrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri walau datam bil lisani yafqahu qawli subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Praise be to Allah who has given us mercy and blessing until we can meet here in Zoom applications. Salawat and salam to our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yeah, who brought us from the darkness time to the light, to the lightness. And I would like to thanks to Dr. Sami, yeah, for giving us an opportunity, learning, yeah, and listening about his book, yeah, entitled "Ethical Teaching of Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, Economics of Happiness." And I would like also to thanks to Ghazali Project Indonesia, who conduct this very great event for us till we can meet this night. And to all participants, thank you very much for attending this webinar, yeah, organized by the Ghazali projects. Before I proceed to the talk, yeah, by Dr. Sami, I would like to read a brief a biography of him, yeah. Dr. Sami Al-Daghistani, yeah, he was graduated from Leiden University, yeah, and then is an author, yeah, of many books, yeah. One of them is Ethical Teaching of Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, Economic of Happiness, that we would like to review, yeah, to know about this book. He also a postdoctoral fellow in Islamic Studies, yeah, in Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society, yeah, in Oslo, and then associate faculty members, Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, New York City, and then research fellow, yeah, Middle East Institute, Columbia University, yeah. Before that, I would like to call Dr. Lisa, yeah, as the project coordinator of Ghazali Project Indonesia to give a speech, yeah. For her, yeah, the time is you.
Thank you so much, Pak Nurizal. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Rabbi Sohri Sotri wa Yasili Amri wa Hudata Medisani of Kokoli. Alhamdulillah. First of all, praise to Allah, and I will also let's send our salawat to our Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And secondly, I would like to say thank you so much for our speaker today, Dr. Sami Al-Daghistani. Nice to meet you, and thank you for sharing with us your work in this occasion. And also I would like to say thank you for the team for facilitating our discussion tonight. Jakarta time. Maybe just an introduction about what we are currently doing in the Ghazali Project Indonesia. So actually this project was initiated by Professor Dr. Asad Zaman. He based in Pakistan. And what we are currently doing is actually to promoting Islamic worldview. So we as Muslim also, we acknowledge that we have Quran and we need to appreciate Quran as the main reference for our facing this life. And the main issue that we are currently identifying in this project is that most of Muslim today is currently seems like losing for this precious books, Quran. So sometimes we need to recall again, and we need to share awareness about these things. And what we are currently doing is we trying to use the approach that Imam Al-Ghazali used to how to then we can appreciate Quran so that we can implement the value and also the things that the wisdom from the Quran in our life based on our subject. Professor Asad Zaman is currently also developing an approach to as an alternative to social science, Western social science called as Ulumul Umran. And also we are currently also opening and also conducting a course in name as Real Statistic. It is also an example on how we try to implement Islamic worldview in the statistic course. And in parallel, where we have a monthly discussion called as a Sunday Talk with our Professor Asad Zaman. We also hosting a monthly webinar, and in this month, we are really having a great pleasure to have opportunity to have discussion with Dr. Sami. Thank you so much. And for those who are the first time joining this event, you can follow our media social, and also you can join our group so that you later on can be updated for the upcoming program. I think that's all. I just would like to say thank you once again to our speaker, and let's learn together from him, inshallah. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum.
Yeah. Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Dr. Lisa Listiana, yeah, for your speech. Yeah. So she already informed us, yeah, about the Ghazali project of Indonesia. Yeah. Now it is the time, yeah, to hear, to listen, yeah, the talk, yeah, from Dr. Sami Al-Daghistani, yeah, about Imam Ghazali, yeah, related to his economic ideas. Yeah, as we know, Imam Ghazali is an ulama, yeah, famous ulama in Indonesia. Yeah, actually, because Indonesia mostly is Shafi'i, yes, Shafi'i mazhab. Yeah. So without further ado, yeah, I would like to call Dr. Sami Al-Daghistani to give his talk about his book, Ethical Teaching of Hamid Al-Ghazali, Economic of Happiness. The time is yours, Dr. Sami.
Thank you so much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation, especially to Nurizal and his team at the Eskia University College, as well as the Ghazali Project Indonesia. It's a pleasure to present my book at your institution, and I really look forward also to engaging with the comments and questions you might have after my talk. Just give me 1 second so I can share the screen that I have. Okay, can everyone see the
Yes,
PowerPoint?
Dr. Sami, yeah, we can see. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So what I have in mind is to provide a few main arguments of Al-Ghazali's economic thought or economic philosophy. And before I'm going to just provide a kind of a brief overview of some of the major key points or arguments. Then I'm going to move forward to discuss some of the key concepts such as fiqh and also happiness or sa'ada in his work. And then lastly, we're going to really delve kind of head on in Al-Ghazali's economic thought. So obviously the book is about Al-Ghazali's economic philosophy, but I think that his ideas can also more broadly be read within the context of the so-called ethical economic genre in Islamic tradition. So Al-Ghazali really complements a few scholars that came before him, some of them being Al-Shaybani, Ibn Abi al-Dunya, especially Al-Muhasibi and Al-Raghib al-Isfahani. Now, Al-Ghazali in his ilk really thought of economics as a human science. This is what I claim, that it's intricately related to other fields of inquiry, right? So in this regard, economics becomes part of broader metaphysical considerations, which is closely associated with ethical, even cosmological and ecological understanding of the universe. So reading and then kind of rereading Al-Ghazali's economic philosophy presupposes also a critique of positivistic theories of and also approaches to economics, in how those theories present a rather narrow understanding or interpretation of economic life, that it's usually based either on something called mathematical deductivism or free market economy. And these are one of the most prevalent approaches in economic world today. I would argue that both of these go against the very grain of the ethical teachings as put forward by Al-Ghazali. Why? Because these approaches suggest that we should not accommodate any ethical theories of metaphysical proportions in economic thought, right? But then looking back into the Islamic economic tradition, we see that economic predicaments cannot be studied on their own terms, but in relation, obviously, to other fields of human sciences, right? So the book really explores then pre-modern economic thought in Islamic tradition, and I see it as an invitation to kind of rethink the importance of classical economic scholarship on the subject. Because I would say that it's valid not only for those who study Islamic sciences more broadly, but also for historians or economists more specifically. Why? Because economic problems or questions cannot be solved by economists alone, right? So Al-Ghazali in this context presents a culmination of what I call ethical economics or ethical economic thought. He's providing an analytical approach to various economic processes. And as already mentioned, he's building upon philosophical reasoning and kind of Sufi principles from various scholars, especially Al-Muhasibi and Al-Isfahani, among many others. In essence, Al-Ghazali teaches us that one way of recovering ethics, and we can discuss more specifically what exactly entails ethical thought or ethical teachings in Al-Ghazali's context, in the current debates of modern economic issues, is really to resort back to Islamic intellectual heritage. And that's one of the key points, right? And that very heritage also helped obviously shape, to an extent, our modern world, including moral philosophy. So I would like to now delve into some of Al-Ghazali's major points on law, happiness, and economics. But before doing that, I think it's necessary for us to give a little bit of a context of Al-Ghazali's intellectual path in relation to his opus. So we know well that Al-Ghazali made seminal contributions to the fields of kalam, falsafa, tasawwuf, even legal theory, right? And he wrote many chapters in his opus magnum, Ihya Ulumuddin, on economic conduct. So this is like one of the, later on, we're going to see that thinking of his economic philosophy, one book that we cannot bypass is obviously Ihya Ulumuddin. So I think that in order to position Al-Ghazali's economic philosophy within his overall work, which really spans many different fields, many different texts, we have to think of him as a scholar of heterogeneity. What I mean by that, in that he worked at the intersection of various domains that are typically understood as having a separate epistemology. One being Sufi mystical tradition, and again, not all of Sufism is mystical to begin with. Second, philosophy or philosophical reasoning. Third, theology or kalam. And fourth, Islamic law, or broadly speaking, Islamic legal theory. So his overall theory on the ethics of happiness, which is one of the key concepts in his economic philosophy, is based on ideas and reasonings from all these fields. So his theoretical account then can be found in some of the major works, one of them being Ihya Ulumuddin, but also to much lesser extent, Mizan al-Amal, Nasihat al-Muluk, and al-Mustasfa. And by merging something called kasb as acquisition of wealth, right? And zuhd as renunciation of the world under the banner of trusting God, if you will, or tawakkul, Al-Ghazali then develops an economic thought as part of his overall theory of happiness. And I see that as a comprehensive ethical epistemology, if you will, that he really sculpts in Ihya Ulumuddin. What is it centered on? It's basically centered on the notion of the science of the hereafter, or in Arabic, ilm al-akhirah or ilm tariq al-akhirah, right? Which again is embedded in the ethics of happiness. Now, ethics of happiness relates to both theoretical knowledge, or ilm, and praxis as informed practice, or amal, right? So just keep that in mind, that ilm and amal are inextricably related, and they go hand in hand, right? So Ihya then covers both theoretical and practical aspects, which in other words means science of praxis, ilm al-mu'amala, which again is very important for economic thought, but I don't think it should be equated with economic thought. And by extension of that, I mean that economic thought in Islamic tradition is related to, yet separate from, fiqh and legal theory. And we can delve into details later. So you have ilm al-mu'amala and the science of unveiling, or as Al-Ghazali calls it, ilm al-mukashafa. And ilm al-mukashafa is believed to be of Sufi origin, right? While his autobiography, Munqidh, is often regarded as his work on Sufism, according to Kenneth Garden, this cannot be said with certainty for Ihya, even though obviously one can find not only theological and philosophical, but also Sufi undertones or Sufi currents, right? Especially in the 4th volume, in the last 10 books of Ihya. And it also makes a lot of references to earlier Sufi works, right? So Ihya then perhaps first and foremost can be positioned at the crossroad of both philosophical reasoning and Sufi epistemology, which again is achieved through the ethics of happiness. And they are, and I think later on I have a brief slide to kind of visualize what exactly am I talking about. There are a few or a handful of scholars really who deal with Al-Ghazali's economic philosophy. And I think worth mentioning are Muhammad Ghazanfar, Abdullah Islahi. They've written texts separately, but also a common text on Al-Ghazali. And their text in part also informed and inspired my own work. But their text does not delve into the theoretical intricacies and details between economics and happiness, or between Sharia and Tasawwuf, which are usually perceived as kind of two separate fields or even entities, right? And their text is rather technical in nature. There is also Adi Setia's work and his translations of Al-Ghazali's passages into English, and he's focusing more on the mystical aspects of Al-Ghazali's thought. But the overall negligence, I think, of Ghazali's economic contribution, I think, goes hand in hand with a claim that really Islamic scholarship, classical scholarship, did not offer any significant development in the field of economics, right? In the obviously pre-modern tradition. So here is just a kind of for us to visualize a little bit about Al-Ghazali's ethical epistemology and how does kasb or economic thought really work within that system. Later on, I'm going to discuss these things more in detail. This is just kind of a brief mentioning. So you have kasb as acquisition of wealth, and you have zuhd as renunciation of the world. Now, for a long time, I think these two categories have been perceived as oppositional, right? You cannot engage in kasb for the sake of zuhd or the other way around. From how I read Al-Ghazali, I think the two go hand in hand very much, right? So kasb is related to zuhd and zuhd is related to kasb. Now, these two culminate in the trust of the divine or trust of God, tawakkul. And again, the overarching ultimate aim is ilm al-akhirah, right? Is the science towards the path of the hereafter, if you will. Now, permeated through all this process is, as we shall see later, sa'ada, or eternal happiness, right? Before going head on economic ideas, I would like to touch upon the notions of law, or fiqh, rather, and happiness or sa'ada in Ghazali's work. Now, in light of Ghazali's philosophical, ethical, if you will, epistemology, I think it would be safe to state that economic thought does not stem from fiqh literature alone. Even though something called fiqh al-mu'amalat, right, has become a very important branch of Islamic law, but also of Islamic economics and finance in modern. So Islamic law was not, this is to say that Islamic law was not always historically centered only on economic technical matters. If we perceive Sharia as a divine law and thinking of Quranic normative teachings, it's closely related or associated with ethical consideration also for economic life. And this pertains to questions of purchase, sales, commerce, demand and supply theory, obtaining food, utilization of money, and many other activities, right? So all of these activities as part of Al-Ghazali's project is based on self-accountability, right? Self-accountability, which culminates then again in the trust of the divine, right? So this means that not all economic related teachings or activities can or should be studied only within the legal discourse as far as the technical side of the law is concerned. And this would include also the notion of maslaha, for instance, which has been primarily discussed within Islamic legal discourse. So Al-Ghazali claims that fiqh used to be part, quote, of the science of the hereafter, end of quote, right? So as an ethical theory, right? Fiqh has always been part of the science of the hereafter. Only later than in Islamic history, it becomes associated with jurisprudence as the technical side of the law. So the very term fiqh is then part of religious discourse or religious sciences, right? Ulum ad-din. And he said, quote, if we attach fiqh to the path of the science of the hereafter, it becomes honorable, end of quote. And he also says, quote, fiqh has become a specialized branch of fatwas and waqfs on small detail about them and excessive debate surrounding them. The meaning of fiqh in the first period, namely Islamic period, was, however, undisputedly linked to the science of the path of the hereafter, knowledge of the details of harmful matters of the self, that which corrupts human action, understanding of indulging in the wickedness of the world, perseverance for reaching the grace of the hereafter, and God's fierce domination over the heart, end of quote. So in other words, the very engagement with law necessitates an ethical reason or ethical subjectivity. And this extends obviously to economic life, to commerce, to finances. Al-Ghazali even labeled the legal specialists or fuqaha as the scholars of the world, right? Ulama al-dunya in his time. And he positioned law in the service of higher goals, right? Of the hereafter. Now, this view pertains to Al-Ghazali's ethics of happiness. So what does he mean with sa'ada, or happiness or felicity? You might recall that Mizan al-Amal, the scale of action, is a rather short work on ethics that begins with a call to pursue, for one or Muslim, to pursue happiness or felicity in the afterlife, right? So felicity is not should not be necessarily equated with salvation, which most believers hope to attain, obviously. But in Al-Ghazali's context, felicity or happiness is a state of pleasure that surpasses the pleasure of the saved in the hereafter, right? So again, according to Kenneth Garden, Al-Ghazali presents Sufism as sharing the philosophical ethos of felicity or happiness. So happiness then depends on the usage of our own faculties, such as reason and logic, but also imagination, but also belief or faith, right? And how is happiness achieved? Well, through self-examination and self-knowledge, by recognizing really that one's heart is pure and one's heart becomes contaminated by the pursuits of various desires, which very much pertain also to economic life. So Sa'ada then is an ethics of contentment, right? Ethics of contentment. And it is based both on ethical psychology that Al-Ghazali develops, but also closely related to the teachings of Tasawwuf. Why? Because he's using conceptualizations from various traditions. And he states that, quote, the source of Sa'ada in this world and the hereafter is ilm, end of quote. And that Sa'ada can be really obtained by those who know God, right? So it's an invitation, I guess, to kind of have self-awareness, self-knowledge, but also to engage into self-examination. This implies that the science of the hereafter, again, is the highest aim of Sa'ada, or eternal happiness. Now, this is where economics becomes not only important, but I think a key component. All human activity, including economic engagements, are geared toward, or should be geared toward, a higher goal or higher aim, right? Since acquiring knowledge is inextricably related to its practice, that's something, again, to keep in mind between the notion of ilm and amal. Ihya, then Ihya Ulumuddin, can be depicted as a referential book on how to perform obtained knowledge and demonstrative proof. Demonstrative proof, or in Arabic would be translated as burhan, or in English would be translated as demonstrative proof in day-to-day life, right? So Al-Ghazali really in Ihya addresses various topics of human action. One of these crucial is also economics, or economic life, which pertains to commerce and trade and so forth. So a virtuous or purified soul follows both the revealed law, or divine law, or Sharia, and philosophical postulates that can be detracted from it, right? So Sa'ada can be attained by combining ilm and amal, obtaining first theory and required knowledge, and then putting it into practice, especially in the field of economic thought, because it's, I think, one of the key components for his theory of happiness. So he reminds his readers that mundane affairs, anything that has to do with financial life, really, have to be tackled with ethical care or ethical considerations, and that human life is really on a path toward redemption, right? And it cannot be achieved without a certain degree of service, if you will, to the community. So here you have the very notion of Sa'ada. Again, Sa'ada is central. It permeates his moral or ethical epistemology. The sources of Sa'ada, the central source is obviously ilm, as I would put it as science or knowledge, because we also have something called ma'arifa as knowledge. And it's also obtained through self-knowledge, self-examination. And again, the overarching aim or the ultimate aim is ilm tariq al-akhir, right? This brings us then to, to Al-Ghazali's economic philosophy. Now, despite that Al-Ghazali makes normative statements about righteous living, right? There is a lot of prohibitions. There is a lot of what one should and should not do, and so on and so forth, right? He's obviously sharing his personal opinions and views on what is allowed, what is not allowed, what is illicit, what is illicit. He nonetheless systematizes his economic thought into several branches or fields. And my book really tries to kind of go through some of these normative, but also technical accounts. Most of his ideas can be found, as already mentioned, in Ihya Ulumuddin, specifically in the second book. So you have four, or second volume rather. You have 4 volumes in Ihya Ulumuddin. Each volume has 10 books, right? Predominantly, he discusses economic ideas in the 3rd book of the 2nd volume, which is entitled Adab al-Kasb wal-Ma'ash, as manners of earning a livelihood or a living. But again, his economic ideas to an extent can be found also in the 4th volume, to a much lesser extent in Mizam al-Amal and Nasihat al-Muluk, if we perceive it as, yes, a work of working in political thought, but really I think that ethics has an overtone, even in Nasihat al-Muluk, which has been disputed in the context of whether this is, you know, a text that belongs to Al-Ghazali in the first place or not. 4 chapters in Adab al-Kasb wal-Ma'ash are specifically intended to address economic theory and financial matters or issues. And these are the following: the nature of work, lawful means of earning a livelihood, which concerns really business, as well as trade and exchange and things like that. Then you have justice, equity, and fairness in gaining a livelihood. And this pertains to things such as cheating and counterfeiting of coins or money, hoarding, the prohibition of hoarding, prohibition of overpraising commodities or goods. And then lastly, benevolence and piety in trading. Now, obviously, his economic thought can be divided into several themes, which concerns ethical jurisprudence that include maslaha as a social utility or general well-being, division of labor, development of markets, the function of money, the role of money, the role of hizbah or governmental authority as well. Now, since economic activity is one of the basic human needs, and he said that, you know, people and believers especially should engage in economic activities, one then fulfills the requirements of maslaha or general well-being or social utility also in trade and commerce. So basically, one is invited to engage or even encouraged to engage in economic activities, and this stretches, you know, way prior to Al-Ghazali. Al-Shaybani said the same thing. Abu Yusuf said similar thing. Al-Muhasibi and Al-Isfahani share similar accounts and so forth. But really in Ihya, he develops what I would call the ethical economic subjectivity, right? That encapsulates all human experience based on the idea that the essence of selfhood serves ultimately the divine, right? So even if at times his account is highly normative, in many regards, it presents an ideal set of kind of norms, what one should do and shouldn't do, and maybe not all of them are fully applicable in society. I think his writing simultaneously suggests that there is a critique of governmental officials, even though he was very much involved with the Seljuk authority or regime at the time, and he taught at the famous Nizamiya madrasa in Baghdad and so forth. But it's also, I think, an implicit critique of governmental officials, a genuine kind of dissatisfaction of the socio-political landscape of the time, and very important, a quest to revive the religious teachings of the day, right? If you think of epistemological or ethical epistemology of Al-Ghazali's system, really encapsulated in Ihya. Ihya is basically how to revive the religious teachings of the day that has been forgotten, and how to implement it through ilm al-mu'amala, right? So Al-Ghazali heavily criticizes those who believe that economic activities are related only to survival, right? Either that you have to survive, or that you have to acquire more than what you need. So these are kind of two extremes on two different ends. And he's clearly saying that acquiring wealth or money or mal is intrinsic to human nature, right? It's a means of not only surviving and kind of covering the basic needs of food and shelter and clothing, but it also fosters social relations. It fosters social well-being, if you will. And again, the ultimate goal is not economic engagement as a to gain profit, but the remembrance of the hereafter, right? And he says true gain is rather, quote, in the market of the hereafter, right? In the akhirah, end of quote. So placing, again, worldly economic affairs in the service of achieving eternal happiness. Now, this brings us to two very interesting concepts in Al-Ghazali's economic philosophy, namely money or mal and poverty or faqr. Mal, and I think mal should be translated as money, but also wealth more broadly. Mal became a source or a tool of exploitative practices in the caliphate, despite the emergence of many classical works on economic thought in that period, in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and beyond, right, centuries. And these works would address Sufi and ethical and philosophical religious kind of views on money, either as a medium of exchange or to ensure just measure of goods. So this is how money is usually perceived by Al-Ghazali, but also by former thinkers or scholars. So I think the very important undertone of these classical works, and I would point to maybe Muhasibi, Isfahani, and at least Al-Ghazali, is to point to ethical shortcomings of governmental officials and also learned men, ulama, right, who are dealing with trade and politics and finance. And he's clearly stating, Al-Ghazali is clearly stating that the very objective of trade and commerce is twofold. You can gain minimum subsistence, right, just to kind of survive, or you can gain immense wealth. And what you have to seek is kind of a balance in between, right? There is something called moderation or kifaya. So money is, or wealth rather, is perceived as one of the most important inventions in economic affairs, or even in human history. And Al-Ghazali kind of renders mal as both having benefits, but also harms. You know, it could be beneficial, but it could be a detriment if not handled correctly. And this obviously depends on one's purposes and intentions as niyyah, right? Why can it be harmful? Well, because there is something called hubb al-mal. There is something called hubb al-mal that one can, one can be blindsided by wealth, and one can possess immense wealth. And there is no end to that satisfaction or that need. Now, conversely, mal also includes spiritual, bodily, religious, but also material benefits, if it's a means to a certain end, right, and of human endeavor. And he says, quote, wealth is the biggest temptation of them all, but also the worldly wealth is good for a good man, end of quote. So again, this means that wealth is detrimental, could be detrimental if not handled correctly. But it can be also extremely beneficial for yourself and also for your family, for your society, the community in which you live in, and so on and so forth. So wealth or money is perceived as a means to achieve higher ends. It's never an end to itself. It's a medium of exchange, right? And there is another interesting quote from Yahya. Quote, dirhams and dinars, so the silver and the gold coins, dirham and dinars are not created for any specific reason. They're without value in themselves and are like stones. Rather, they're created for circulation from person to person in order to promote transactions. End of quote. So the twofold approach to mal is it's a tool to secure righteous life, right? It can help actually in achieving righteous life. And it's also a mechanism to counteract human inclination for lust. Again, depends on one's objectivities concerning wealth. So it's beneficial if one spends it not only for religious endeavors, but also for necessities that can lead towards securing these endeavors, such as clothing, shelter, food, and so on and so forth. But it should be spent for whatever is necessary for the accomplishment of wajib, right? So again, there is a two type of compulsory spending in the name of Sharia and spending out of one's own chivalry or good manners or al-marwa. So you can spend because you're obligated to spend based on Islamic law or substantive law, or you can spend out of your own kind of marwa or habit, al-aada, right? If not, then you might become a miser. And if, miserliness is obviously condemned because it can lead to tyranny if it's not, again, handled correctly. So activities that should be at any cost avoided are hoarding of either wealth or even, basic human necessities, counterfeiting of coins, so forging money, not disclosing the true price of a commodity, but also generating false statements of certain goods and providing or generating false advertisements of a commodity in the market. Now, in relation to that is faqr as poverty. And I would like us to think about faqr on at least two levels, that it can mean a socio-economic or economic poverty, but also spiritual poverty, right? Now, socioeconomic poverty is not highly regarded because it means financial impoverishment, right? Nobody should be financially impoverished necessarily. But neither is, again, lust for money. So what you have to seek is a balance between, right? Minimal economic gain is obviously frowned upon because it can mean lack of economic participation in society, and this can lead into disbelief. It can bring about social instability, and so on and so forth. So remedy for that is really kifaya, or moderation, which is the preferred standard of living. So obviously poverty has to be abrogated, financial poverty. But I think Ghazali also talks about faqr in the context of spiritual poverty, in that it can be considered as a spiritual component over riches. Because more than what is needed is poison, on the other hand, right, on the flip side. So poverty is, quote, not to possess what is necessary by removing wants. Not having that which is necessary is not considered poverty. If you have that which is necessary and have command over it, you are not poor. Why? End of quote. Because you know how to handle your own possessions, right? So then poverty can emerge or appear in 5 different ways. There is poverty of the one who renounces the world. That's the highest level of poverty. Why? Because one does not indulge in riches. There is poverty of the one who does not despise wealth, but possesses more than what is necessary. Third level of poverty is of the one who loves wealth, but does not strive to obtain it. Fourth level of poverty is poverty of the greedy, who desire to earn more wealth. And lastly, poverty of the one who strives for wants, yet has no possession of wealth. So in Al-Ghazali's ethical epistemology, right, I would like us to kind of consider then faqr as having an ethical merit. And it's not simply a matter of financial impoverishment or destitution, right? Faqr does have a spiritual or ethical merit, and also has been, a very rather common practice among the followers of Sufism in the classical period. Just to give you a few more examples of economic activities that Al-Ghazali is kind of presenting in his work. Some of them being the following: the trader should be honest in his deeds, right, at the market. And one should earn his living by real work. Why? Because, again, real work is a sign of piety. So again, proper work is perceived as having to do with tawakkul, very much so. He also states that one should not buy from a merchant who is monopolizing the market, because you can jack up the prices, you can raise the prices of a commodity. And also the seller should not sell a commodity to a person who is mentally ill, or a minor, somebody who is blind, a slave also, or someone who makes illicit gains and you know about these gains, right? Because why? This clearly undermines fair or ethical rulings of economic conduct. And also one should not then perform trade activities with the aforementioned persons, right? Moreover, there should be no fraud in weights or quantities of a commodity, because this can determine a price of a commodity. And obviously the correct price has to be disclosed at all times. So in a nutshell, Al-Ghazali is saying that one has to uphold ihsan in the market as an act of generosity. So this actually, it is part of fiqh, but it's also not part of fiqh in the same time, because ihsan is something that pertains to kind of your own moral compass, right? And it's very much associated with adab, which again, at the end of the day, his book in the second volume on economics is called Adab al-Kasb wal-Ma'ash, right? So all of these things pertain to adab. He's also very much in favor of specialization of labor, which might be perceived as a problematic statement or approach. But I do not want us to see the specialization in labor in modern kind of neoliberal terms, whereby work is not equally regarded, right? Different labor, different work is regarded very much differently, is paid very much differently as well. But Al-Ghazali and really his ilk is saying that minimal specialization of labor is necessary because it's beneficial for mutual exchange of goods. It's beneficial for kind of satisfying various needs in a society, right? And he gives example really that comes, a couple of centuries earlier than Adam Smith's kind of, you have the blacksmith and the baker and so on and so forth. And Al-Ghazali is also saying each of these individuals need each other, right? You need a baker because you need to eat food, you need to get bread, and you need a blacksmith because you need certain items and certain goods that could be purchased at the market. So minimum specialization of labor is kind of a required element of his economic philosophy. This also means that in relation to selling and buying goods at a market, this also means that one has to uphold just or fair price, right? Fairness and equity. So not necessarily equality, but equity, as in, each deserves according to his own needs, have to be carried out in the market at all times, right? You have to attain price equilibrium. So the just price of a good, of a commodity, is the prevailing price in the market. And prevailing price then appears, if the prevailing price appears to violate kind of the basic standards of social justice or common good and maslaha, or if a merchant would establish a monopoly in the market, then in these specific cases, the governmental authority has to intervene, if you want. By governmental authority, I mean the institution of Hizbah, right? And Muhtasib as a public auditor or inspector has to intervene. In conclusion, because I would like to leave some time for Q&A and the discussion. If one gathers this quite diverse corpus of Al-Ghazali, think of the ethical work on Mizan al-Amal, the really kind of a philosophical Sufi overtones in Ihya Ulumuddin, Nasihat al-Muluk, which is a mirror for princes, right? But again, in essence, I think it's about ethics, whereas politics comes secondary. The notion of kasb, as Ghazali uses it, as acquisition of wealth, entails qualities of both ilm al-mu'amala and ilm al-mukashafa, right? It does not convey only economic growth. And I think that kasb then should be in the service of kind of wider socio-ecological or even ethical postulates. So I think I'm at least reading Al-Ghazali not primarily as a philosopher, as a Sufi, or as a legal specialist with his Mustasfa. I read him as an ethicist, right? That he's dealing with ethical manners and ethical theories. And this again very much pertains not only on the theoretical level, as in this is ilm al-mukashafa. Ilm al-mukashafa is rooted in a Sufi epistemology. It's very conceptual. On the applicability side of things, eternal happiness or sa'ada can be attained by combining ilm and amal, right? Especially in the field of economics, because it really constitutes kind of a core component of his theory. So instead of kind of labeling or denoting Sufism as a branch of Islam that represents only inner worldly mysticism, Al-Ghazali, but also really Al-Muhasibi and Al-Isfahani especially, they put forward an idea that yes, zuhd as renunciation is very important, but it's inextricably linked to kasb or acquisition of wealth, in that it's an active engagement with the world and society, including economic provision. So kalam and divine law or sharia form part of the ilm al-mu'amala, right? That's ilm al-mu'amala, it's practice. But again, knowledge of these sciences has no necessarily value in itself. It becomes valuable only insofar as it actively applied in practice. I'm going to end at this point, and thank you again very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to engaging with the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sami, for very interesting explanation about Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali in economics, ethical economics philosophy. I note some issues, that at-tawakkul, as the basis, of ethical economic, philosophy of Imam Ghazali. That I also read Al-Makasib wal-Wara, lil Al-Muhasibi. He start with the tawakkul related to Al-Kasab. Okay, I open question and answer. Anyone to ask questions to Dr. Sami? Okay, yeah. I'd like to see from the chat box. Dr. Sami, Dr. Saad Al-Hasbi asks you, did Imam Al-Ghazali define moral law or values for the market and their socio-economic implications?
Yeah, now I see the question in the chat. Did Imam Al-Ghazali define moral laws, values of the market and their socioeconomic implications? Yeah, thank you for this question. So I don't think he's per se explicitly defining or devising moral laws in the market. But if you think about his overall epistemology or ethical epistemology of economic thought, I think it very much also pertains to the institution of Hizbah and Muhtasib, right? Which I haven't really talked much. Now, Hizbah obviously comes in and it's enacted if there are certain inconsistencies or irregularities or illicit transactions being conducted at the market. And one can again perceive the institution of Hizbah, which again is it's not a physical institution in itself, right? Hizbah basically means sanctioning of illicit transactions in goods and markets, and therefore subjects, and also employs a muhtasib as a public inspector or auditor, right? So I think we can perceive that very much as part of fiqh or substantive law. But in the context of Al-Ghazali, substantive law is, I don't think it's parted from moral law, right? I mean, substantive law is based on the divine law, if you will, right? And this is what the fuqaha and the ulama are trying to achieve at the end of the day. So yes, there is an epistemological difference perhaps between fiqh as a substantive law and sharia as a divine law that the ulama are trying to attain, right, and implement this as to the best of their practice and understanding. But the two are kind of built together, right? So one good example is the role and the deeds of the muhtasib, which again, it includes verbal warnings, right? Muhtasib can say, this is allowed, this is not allowed, please kind of remove it from the market. But it can get also much more severe. I think at some point Al-Ghazali and other scholars mention some type of like corporal sanctioning, right, of the merchant or the seller if one is not engaging in kind of righteous behavior or selling illicit goods at the market. So I think all of these kind of instances can form whatever you call moral law. Now, and I'm not sure if I understood your question fully, but if you think about if there is a value of the market itself, this is a slightly different question, right? I think the notion of souk or market in Islamic economic tradition, again, thinking along the lines of the aforementioned scholars, it's a place where you engage in exchange, you engage in selling and trading and buying commodities, right, and goods. But it also involves non-material transactions, I think. And you cannot actually square non-material transaction that easily or sanction non-material. And by non-material transactions, I mean ihsan. Right? Ihsan is part of the market. It can be part of a sale or a purchase. It depends kind of on your practice, on your good manners, on kindness, for instance. So these are all non-material transactions, and they very much constitute part of the quote unquote market in the Muslim world, or at least was in the Muslim world. So you do have the very much the engagement with the material, right? The goods, the commodities, and so on and so forth. But also the non-material or immaterial, which very much pertain to Sharia stipulations, divine stipulations, for instance.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sami. Sister Nurusna, if you want to ask, please open your mic. Your question is too long. If I read your questions, think if you want to ask directly to Dr. Sami, you can open your mic. Or the others. Yeah, okay, I will read. Actually, Sister Nur Hasna is asking you about the importance of Maqasid al-Sharia in Islamic economy and finance. Yeah, and the relevant parties concerned to promote the objective of Sharia in marketplace. Yeah, I think currently Maqasid Sharia is become famous. Yeah, in Islamic economy and finance. Most of the researchers they make some index, yeah, using Maqasid Sharia from
Yeah,
Al-Ghazali perspective.
yeah. Yeah, thank you for this to Nur Husna and also I think Muhammad Mondir. I think I will try to combine the two questions that pertain to Maqasid al-Sharia in Islamic economics and finance. So I think, yes, Nurizal, you're absolutely right that Maqasid al-Sharia discourse has become very prominent in Islamic economics and finance, even the banking system today. I think there is some merit to it. I think we should not be blinded by only that particular discourse, but there is absolutely some merit to it in the sense that Al-Juwayni and especially Al-Ghazali talk about the preservation of 5 categories, right? And yes, 2 of them being deen, preservation, hifdul deen, but also hifdul mal, right? And if you want to deduce the moral elements from Sharia, you would they would be encapsulated in the Maqasid discourse, right? And it really pertains to the preservation of 5 categories, including mal or wealth. Now, so I think, therefore, yes, this discourse is very important for Islamic finance or economics and finance. Because it does talk about the very notion of preservation according to Islamic legal discourse, right? And Al-Ghazali talks about it in Al-Mustasfa. But I think I would at least like to supplement the Maqasid discourse with other equally important, but somewhat neglected conceptualizations. And that would include, for instance, adab, or which again pertains to kasb as acquisition of wealth. It pertains to iqtisad, which in our modern contemporary English we translate as economics, which again it's that would be an unjust. It would be, I think we would do injustice to the very concept of iqtisad if we translate it as economics, because it has a modern connotation kind of attached to it, right? But so I want to pause on the notion of adab. It's not just Al-Ghazali's book that talks about it. Many other scholars that predate him discuss the notion of adab. And adab, I mean, in a very broad sense, that it does pertain to kind of mannerisms, or moral compass, moral chivalry, if you will. And again, it's both, that it's a concept connected to the divine law, to Sharia, but it's not, as scholars have pointed out in the past, but it's not necessarily rooted in the Quranic discourse. Right? Adab is not rooted in the Quranic discourse, but it's yet very much it becomes part and parcel of an Islamic environment in the classical period. So maslaha, in my opinion, could be positioned in tandem with, or should be regarded in tandem with, adab, right? Maslaha is this kind of, how do you generate the well-being in a society? How can you enact good behavior in economic practices that again could be implemented in market or even in market economy, right? So I think these are all kind of instances where we can really learn from Al-Ghazali. But I have to say, though, in relation to that, I came to believe that there is no one economic system that is going to work for the majority of people on planet Earth. Whether this is socialism for some, neoliberal capitalism for others, unfortunately, or even whatever we call Islamic economic system, I don't think it's going to work for the majority of people. So what Al-Ghazali and his kind is asking us to do. And I think we have to pay attention to the both individual and the community, right? Al-Ghazali is always saying, well, it's you, the individual, that can implement certain ethical postulates in how you deal with economic transactions or engagement or economic life that has repercussions for the community at large, or your own neighbors, or your own family, right? So again, the salvation and the eternal happiness is not placed on the community at large. Why? Because I think it's impossible to attain, right? There's never going to be one economic system that is going to work for the majority of folks. So it's the individual that is kind of rendered according to ethical postulates. And this is where also maslaha as a very notion of well-being, of general well-being, or even social utility can be implemented. Why? Because maslaha, again, it's very different from the concept of utility, that you take and you maximize whatever you want, right? Maslaha is not saying that. Maslaha is actually presupposing a very conscious, a very considerate approach, that it's an ethical category based on the notion of tawheed at the end of the day, right? So it does have a ethical or even religious undertone.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sami. I think we got the answer, yeah, from the answer of Dr. Sami regarding maqasid Sharia or al-maslahah, yeah. So I can conclude that the maslah is connected to adab, yeah, connected to the divine law and the higher objective of the Sharia.
That's correct. I see another question. Actually, there was, I think, it was sent directly to my message. Thank you so much, Saleh, for your kind words. His question is, do you think that Al-Ghazali's understanding of happiness looks like similar to the understanding of the Greek philosopher, and in the brackets is like self-centered? That's an interesting question. I think to an extent, it might have some similarities, right? That it's a self-centered ethics, but I think it very much ties into the previous answer that I gave in relation to maslaha. Why? Because even though to an extent, Al-Ghazali also referenced other non-Muslim scholars and referred to other non-Muslim philosophies, including ancient Greek philosophers, right? So there is some correlation right there, but I would read Al-Ghazali in the context of individual communitarianism. Again, that it's pertaining to both. Yes, it's a self-centered happiness, because you're trying to achieve your own salvation at the end of the day. You will not achieve a salvation for someone else, right? So you have to put yourself on the spot in the context of economic theories. Now, this does not mean self-centered in a very modern neoliberal understanding of the term, that it's about Jeremy Bentham's hedonism, right? Philosophical hedonism, for instance, whereby you maximize utility for your own sake. This is not exactly what Al-Ghazali is saying. So yes, you can achieve, and you must achieve your own happiness, but by practicing adab, by being engaged in the market, which is helpful for your own kind of inner circle. Again, you're not going to influence somebody else across the world, perhaps, with your whatever economic engagement, but you can help your neighbor, right? Because if you're well off, if you engage in righteous practice, you can support your own family members, your own neighbors, your own community. So it does have a kind of a wider, if you will, societal impact. So it's a self-centered, if you will, by using your words, self-centered ethics that very much has a societal impact if enacted according to, Al-Ghazali's system. And I think there may be a few more. Maybe there are a few more questions there.
Yeah, I think finish the questions, Dr. Sami. I would like to thank Dr. Sami for all answers. Yeah, I think we're gonna learn much again from you from the other discussion, inshallah. Yeah, I think it is very interesting also discussing about your dissertations. Yeah, because you discuss about wider than Imam Ghazali, yeah, because you touching Nakib Alatas, Al Faruqi, which is uh, Nakib Alatas also talking about adab, you know, our Muslim world crisis about adab. Yeah, so adab is the important thing, related to ethical economic that you are saying now.
Absolutely, yeah. I think if this book is specifically kind of it zooms into Al-Ghazali's thought and then trying to position Al-Ghazali also in conversation with classical and modern kind of Western economics. The other book, the Making of Islamic Economic Thought, is broader in that it, on one hand, it critiques modern Islamic economics to an extent by being too much focused on the Islamization part, and by also merging certain elements from different economic traditions and genres, including classical economic thought. But also then I kind of try to delve into the pre-modern thinking, right? And that would include indeed, Shaybani, Al-Muhasibi, Al-Isfahani, Ibn Abil Dunya, and Al-Ghazali to much lesser extent. So I think moving forward, what I think is important, and I'm saying this only as someone who is, first of all, who is not an economist, right? I'm trained I'm trained within Islamic studies, and someone who is simply doing research on these topics. I think it's important for us to understand what are the benefits, but also limitations of, let's say, the Islamization project, which again is very important, and it was valid for in the period in which it emerged. But thinking along the lines of also Sayyid Alatas, for instance, of the notion of indigenization, how to look back into our own traditions, right, into the Islamic tradition, and foresee it what it is, right, to kind of extract, be it ethical, be it metaphysical, be it to an extent maybe more religious, but not less scientific, theories of and approaches to economic thought, I think can be not only beneficial for the Muslim world at large, but it also implicitly critiques the prevalent theories of economics, which are very narrowly presented and always defined as scientific, right? That they are based on scientific reasoning, which I think is very much incorrect, right? Economics is not necessarily, from my perspective, a science on its own, and it can only be engaged in relation to other fields, right? And now I see there's one final question from Saad Al-Hashmi, which relates in part to what we're discussing now. He's asking, quote, is the conventional economics based on ethical foundations, and what is the difference with Islamic ethical system? Thanks for this question. So this is exactly what one part of my other book deals with that, right? And I'm trying to say that, yes, on one hand, there is a difference between the two systems, even though I'm very critical of modern Islamic economic theories, because one, they are overwhelmingly focused on the financial technical aspects of Islamic finance and banking. And two, to a large extent, they really became a niche within the global economic system, right? And I don't want to delve too deep into the critiques of contemporary Islamic economic project, but on the other hand, is there an ethical consideration? I think any economic system is going to claim that it has some type of ethical foundations, including neoliberal economics, right? Everyone is going to say, every system is going to defend that idea. It just depends to what extent is that implemented and within what philosophical tradition, right? And thinking about neoliberal economics, one could say, well, it's ethical. Why? Because it provides so much, even though it provides so much to only a few. And we're not equal, and hence we don't have to have an equal lives, and some are, are going to be well off and others are not going to be well off. Now, this obviously goes very much against the grain of what Al-Ghazali is putting forward, and what I think is the core of pre-modern economic thought, which is very much based on the notion of equity, on the notion of ethical teachings, and it's rooted in that kind of adabi tradition of the moral self, right? It has to deal with self-examination. It has to deal with, the field of falsafa. It has to deal with kalam. It has to be theorized within tasawwuf. So you cannot find, you can find perhaps these approaches within different religious traditions, Buddhism to an extent as well. But I don't think you can find that level of spiritual development within neoliberal capitalism, right? For economic system. I think this is clear from the get-go. So there is an opportunity to revive some of these teachings from the classical period, and could be very easily implemented, I think, even in the modern discourse. The question is only to what extent and how many people are going to benefit from it, right? Because again, it's not going to be for the majority of the society.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Sami, and for all participants. Yeah, and I'd like to thanks to Dr. Sami for coming and sharing sessions, yeah, on Ghazali ethical economics. And then I can conclude today that economic cannot stand by itself. Yeah, it has a relationship to other field like kalam, yeah, and tasawwuf, yeah, and the others religious knowledge, as mentioned by Dr. Sami. And again, see you again, Dr. Sami, in another occasions, another event, inshallah. I hope so coming to see you in maybe in US or in Norway, inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nurizal, again to you, to the Ghazali Project Indonesia, to the Tazkiyah University College. It was a pleasure engaging with you and your audience. And inshallah, I hope to see you at either this or the other corner of the world, inshallah, in the future. Thank you so much.
I end my, this webinar by reciting Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Subhanakallah bihamdik, Asyhadu an la ilaha anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Dr. Sami. See you again.
Thank
See
you,
you again.
Dr. Sami.
Ma'asalam. Ma'asalam to everyone. Fi manillah.
Ya manillah.